Hey everybody, welcome to this Friday edition of NFL Fantasy Live here on Friday the 13th. Here with Marcus Grant, Adam Rank, and Maurice Jones-Drew, who are here to help turn your luck around in Week 10. Michael F. Florio is going to jump in here in a bit, not wearing a mask, no knives, nothing scary. Halloween's over, that's all in the past. We appreciate you, the viewers, so much. A big thanks to everybody who emailed us, wanting to come on the show, be a part of our upcoming Fantasy Bunch segment. A programming note, we're going to do the Fantasy Bunch again on Tuesday, November 24th. I will have more info on that to come, so stay tuned there. As for today, let's kick things off with our Sunday Showdowns as we preview every single matchup on Sunday of Week 10 for fantasy players of all stripes. We begin with a couple of historic AFC heavyweights who have hit a few bumps in the road. The Ravens and the Patriots. Rank, do you trust Lamar against Bills defense?
Yes. Why do I keep getting questions about this? Listen, he's scored at least 20. He's averaging 20 fantasy points per game this season. That makes him the QB 11. You're starting him. I understand. You overreached and you drafted him in the second round, and now you're mad at him? You're the one who overdrafted him. He's been fine this year. At least 18 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 3. He's running the ball. He's going to score you 20 points this week. Calm down and get him into your lineup.
Well, if we're starting Lamar Jackson, then we are cautiously starting Marquise Brown. I know he has underwhelmed this year, but I think you got to consider him at least as a flex this week. He's going against that going against that Patriots defense that has given up some deep throws, and keep an eye on what happens with Stephon Gilmore. I know that the numbers say that the Patriots are tough against wide receivers, but we saw last week when Gilmore was not completely healthy that the Jets were able to get some big plays against them. So I think that you can get at least a couple of deep shots with Hollywood Brown this week.
All right, let's go over to the Bucks and the Panthers in the South. MJD, you got to sit?
Yeah, I'm gonna sit DJ Moore, and it's really there's two things. One is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are coming off a tremendous loss, and we know that they're gonna come back and play lights out. And then the other thing is this: he only had 3 targets in Week 9 against Kansas City, and 5th most on Carolina, so he's not really being targeted. It seems like they're focusing more on Curtis Samuel, Robbie Anderson, obviously Christian McCaffrey when he was back. So I would just cautiously, I don't know about playing him this week.
I'm going to go on the other side of that one and say start MJD, Mr. Rob Gronkowski. I know this past week was tough, but here's what happened. He still got the targets. He still got an end zone target, and his practice absences this week weren't injury related. He's arrested Gronk, and though that drop did cost him a 4-game touchdown streak, he still had a chance to catch it. Maybe he can start a new streak coming up on Sunday. Let's go over to the Niners and the Saints. Marcus, which of your Niners do you trust the most in this one?
Well, I think this one's for me, Patrick, but I'm going to say start Jerick McKinnon. And it's more of a game script for me. I know everyone's going to say, oh, my God, the Saints are great against running backs. Well, if the Niners are down and Nick Mullins has to check the ball down, they're going to play a ton of McKinnon, and he's going to catch a ton of passes. And if you're in a PPR league, he may mess around and get you 10 catches in this game. So I would start McKinnon. I'm going to start him, actually.
I'm going to look at starting Brandon Ayuk in this one because I feel like the game script is going to favor the Niners having to throw the football to kind of keep up with the Saints offense in this one. And Ayuk has 6 or more targets in 4 of the 7 games he's played. Could have a pretty safe floor considering the number of injuries the 49ers have, especially at wide receiver. Plus, before shutting down the Bucs last week, the Saints had given up 2 or more touchdown catches to wide receivers in 3 straight. So I think Ayuk is good for a bounce back.
So we got multiple Niners to trust between Marcus and MJD. Now to the Jags and the Packers. Marcus, a lot of fantasy points maybe in this one?
Perhaps, but I'm still a little bit wary about DJ Chark, mostly because the Packers secondary has been pretty good. Now, if there's some upside here, we'll keep an eye on what happens with Jair Alexander, who's in the concussion protocol, because he's just been locking down on guys this year. But still, the Packers have given up the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers, the 4th fewest receiving yards overall to the position. So there are some concerns I have with DJ Chark. You might not be benching him, but you might have to lower your expectations.
We do expect a lot of points to be scored in this game. The problem is we expect the Packers to score most of them because they feasted on bad secondaries. That is why I say start Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Swing for the fences. Swing with him. He's had less than 10 points in every game this season, except the 2 where he had 19 plus. I think this could be one of those 19-point games against a team that's had so many folks get healthy against them late this season. He's available in a lot of spots. I think a nice sleeper would be Marquez Valdez-Scantling in this game. We got 8 more Sunday matchups to get throughout the hour here on Fantasy Live. We're going to come back to those, but in the meantime, let's get everybody some news that they might have missed. It's time for In Case You Missed It, with some headlines for you. We start with Christian McCaffrey, yet again, out for Week 10. No surprise there, he's dealing with that injury to the AC joint in his shoulder. There's some optimism in Carolina that he might be able to play next week. In the meantime, Mike Davis riding again for the Panthers. And another running back on the injury report, Joe Mixon of the Bengals. He's listed as doubtful for Sunday's matchup with the Steelers. Rank, you going to start Gio against Pittsburgh?
You know what? I believe I'm going to do it. He's averaged over 20 fantasy points per game in the 6 times that he's played without Mixon since 2017. He's averaged over 21 the last 2 weeks without him, which would make him the RB5. Now, understandably, this is a tough matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and typically you would want to avoid it. But anytime you have a player with this kind of talent getting the volume we're expecting to see, I say you got to get him into the lineup, and I understand it's a bad matchup, but sometimes you got good players against a bad matchup.
And a guy that we expected to be a very good player this year, Kenyon Drake's going to be a game-time decision for Arizona this Sunday due to that ankle injury that's kept him out. Cliff Kingsbury saying today, quote, "We want to make sure he feels good pregame, can do what he does best. If not, then he won't go." MJD, how much do you trust Chase Edmonds, whether Kenyon Drake plays or not?
Well, I'm going to start Chase Edmonds. He's out-snapped Kenyon Drake since week 3, and that's huge. He fits his offense a little bit more than what Kenyon Drake was. And I remember last year around this time, Kenyon Drake kind of got rolling. But he's been banged up, and the most consistent back they have is Chase Edmonds. So for me, if it's a game-time decision, that means I'm going to go with Chase Edmonds to start or put in my flex.
Got some more injuries over in Detroit, 2 of them to catch you up on. Kenny Golladay is going to miss his 2nd game with a hip injury. He has been considered week to week. As well as TJ Hawkinson popped up midweek with a toe injury. He's considered questionable. Marcus, finding a tight end has been tough all week. This doesn't help. Who can we use as an emergency backup if we're missing out on Hawkinson?
Jordan Reed is a name you should probably keep in your back pocket depending on what happens with TJ Hawkinson this week. He's just coming back off injury. I know last week was very much on a limited play count, so we didn't see a whole lot of him, but hopefully this week he's a little bit healthier, gets some more opportunities. We saw early in the year when George Kittle went down that Reed stepped in and saw a lot of opportunity, and the Saints have been pretty pliable when it comes to fantasy tight end. So again, this is sort of a break glass in case of emergency sort of thing, but Jordan Reed could be an option for you.
And now we got some injury news from the source itself. Chargers running back Austin Eckler posted this video of himself running what looks like full speed on Twitter. And he said to all my fantasy owners that didn't drop me, the time draws near. Working his way back from that hamstring injury. The fantasy community appreciates your notice, sir. Thanks to Austin Eckler. Let's get over to last night's action. The Colts and the Titans kicking off Week 10 in style. Rank. Nyheim Hines stole the show.
Yeah, can one of these Colts running backs get on Twitter before the game and be all, "Hey man, I'm going to be the dude who gets the ball 17 times," because that would really be beneficial, because it's getting really annoying trying to figure out what to do with this Colts backfield. I almost wish you could play with the designation of, I'm just taking the Colts running backs and that's going to be it. But you know what? This is kind of an approach that we've seen from Frank Reich, is that he is looking at the hot hand. And over the last couple of weeks, it's been Nyheim Hines, was Jordan Wilkins. Before that, we haven't seen Jonathan Taylor. So hopefully at some point, for anybody who's drafted him, that we see him eventually.
Well, if there's such a thing as a wide receiver by committee, that's probably what the Colts were doing there. And last night, it was Michael Pittman's turn, led the Colts in wide receiver snaps. He's actually had a couple nice weeks, had 15 combined targets over the past 2 games. He's only rostered in 1% of NFL.com leagues, and I know that right now nobody is clamoring for Colts wideouts, but he has a very favorable schedule the rest of the season. You just hope that this passing game gets a little bit more consistent before you decide to go and put him in your lineup.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that, every week I always advise people to go pick up somebody who's playing in a Thursday night game. Sometimes with LaMichael Pirine, it didn't work out. Michael Pittman, it worked out. But I think the biggest takeaway that people are looking back to is Jonathan Taylor, because nobody really knows what to do with him. And I just mentioned it, how frustrating this running back by committee can be. And to give it a little bit more clarity, I wouldn't drop Jonathan Taylor. I understand the frustration, but I think that this offense is too good and this offensive line is too good to just let him go on the waiver wire. So if you're sitting there fretting what to do, and I know it's frustrating because you probably used the 4th or 5th round pick on him, you're just going to have to hold him on the bench for now.
Yeah, for me, we're going to talk about Corey Davis, who came out and gave you 11 fantasy points, which is good, a little bit more than I expected, but he was out there playing with a heavy heart as his brother passed away from cancer. And so, I think sometimes we have to remember that these guys, yes, even though they're on our fantasy teams and we're managing them and doing those things, they are real people and they deal with a lot of things. So kudos to him to go out there and play through a tough time and perform the way he did. I mean, he was one of the only bright spots for this Tennessee offense down the stretch.
And I was really of the mind that A.J. Brown was going to be able to step up in a matchup that was pretty tough. And I think that, I unfairly took a few shots at Marcus and kind of gloated and said, there's no way I'm not sitting this guy. And then this happens. He drops the ball. I dropped the ball. We didn't get a lot of fantasy points. You know what? Sometimes we have really good players like this and they just don't score points. And I know it's unfortunate and it's going to be tough to sit there throughout the weekend and see 3.1 where a 20 spot normally would be. But A.J. Brown is an excellent receiver, and this kind of stuff happens. You're going to be fine. You can still rally and win this week.
I know people are going to look at Derrick Henry's 11.9 points and be sort of disappointed about it, but he actually played pretty well. Had over 100 rushing yards, only had the 1 catch, but still gave you a good number in terms of production. Just was missing the touchdown. If he scores a touchdown, then that gets him closer to 18 points, and everybody sort of looks at it and says, all right, that's a pretty good Derrick Henry game. So this is one where I think, looking at the box score, looking at the fantasy points, doesn't necessarily tell the whole story of how Derrick Henry played last night.
We are back on Fantasy Live for another round of Breaking the Ranks, in which our personal fantasy curmudgeon, Adam Rank, tells our NFL.com fantasy player rankings mastermind, Michael F. Florio, to get off his lawn. Rank, tell us which quarterback ranking that you feel Florio just completely messed up on this week.
Well, Florio does a really nice job for us, and I want to commend him. But let's talk a little bit about Tom Brady being the QB9 this week. Because the last time Tom Brady was embarrassed in primetime, holding up the 4 fingers, looking for a 5th down against the Chicago Bears, he went out the following week and threw for 166 and a pair of touchdowns. Now, he's a good quarterback, and I think at some time you'll be like, shh, it's Miller time because they win. But I think this ranking is way too high, Mike.
Rank, you kind of picked apart the argument there with the bad game after the getting embarrassed, because I was going to say to you, like, you love Aaron Rodgers after he gets embarrassed. I think Tom Brady is of the same ilk, but also why I like Tom Brady is because the Panthers have allowed the second most completions of 20-plus air yards this year. And with those weapons all around him, I'm expecting a few long passes for Brady to get completed.
All right.
All right, we'll see how touchdown Tom does. Let's look over, Rank, at a running back out of the football team, J.D. McKissick. Where do you feel Florio messed up there?
Well, I really like J.D. McKissick this week, and I think 24 means he's a low-end RB2. I think he can give you RB1 production. He's got at least 7.5 targets per game since week 4. He's had 6+ receptions in 4 out of his last 5 games. And the Lions have allowed the most fantasy points to running backs this season. So I know that we're splitting hairs here, but this is a nod to Florio doing such a great job. I just think that McKissick is going to end up somewhere around RB12 this week.
That's fair. I do like McKissick, especially with Alex Smith. He has more targets from Smith than anyone else on this team. But last week was his first game over 15 fantasy points. And what it really comes down to is, with the Lions' offense being so banged up and then being so weak at stopping the run, I think Washington is going to rely on their defense and their run game. I think it is a big Antonio Gibson week, actually.
I like both of them in the
fantasy,
top 12.
one of the few things that One of the few things that could make that Washington-Detroit matchup interesting to watch. Let's go over to the Minnesota Vikings ranking Adam Thielen. You feel like Mike whiffed on this one as well?
Oh, too low. Actually, you know what, Michael? This is a personal favor to me. I have a huge fear that Adam Thielen, even though the Bears have allowed, 3 passing touchdowns to receivers this season, that Thielen's going to go out and have 50 fantasy points. And I think that if you ranked him in the top 5, we could reverse jinx him, because I need the Bears to win this week. I think this is a selfish, more than my fantasy team. I need a jinx on the Vikings if possible, because I think that Kirk Cousins legitimately doesn't like me and wants to spite me.
Rank, are you in my head right now? Because what I was planning on saying to you was Rank, you know how good this Bears secondary has been. They're not allowing touchdowns. They're not allowing fantasy points to wide receivers. I was going to say this sounds like a reverse jinx from you, because you know how good that Bears secondary is.
I'm that transparent, yes.
I love it's the reverse jinx attempts from Rank we see them coming, but there's still something to enjoy every single time. If you want to see the rest of Michael F. Florio's player rankings, which you can use as a cheat sheet to solve all your toughest roster decisions, go over to NFL.com/fantasy and just take it in, because he works really hard on it. Almost as hard as Rank works to get at Kirk Cousins, who hates him personally and deeply. Let's get back to the Sunday showdowns. The Chargers and the Dolphins. Mike, give us a sleeper, man.
I think Tua Tagovailoa is a sleeper in this one. He, last week in his second NFL game, threw for nearly 250 yards, 2 touchdowns, scored over 21 fantasy points. Not bad for your second start, and I think he can build off of it against the Chargers, who allow the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, including 2 or more passing touchdowns in 3 straight. And you know you're going to be watching this game. Tua, Herbert, why not get a little fantasy action in it?
I love that pick. I'm going to start Tua wherever possible, but now it's a revenge game for Kalen Ballage going up against the Miami Dolphins, who've allowed a top 25 fantasy running back in 5 of the last 6 games. They've allowed the 7th most yards per game this season. And Kalen he got into the game last week when Justin Jackson went down. And unfortunately, I had Jackson in a number of spots. He looked really good, and as a unabashed ASU fan, I've been waiting for this kind of breakout, and I'm going to get him into my lineup this week because I have a lot of faith that he's going to be able to run on this Dolphins defense.
All he needed was to get back on this side of the United States. We'll go over to the Seahawks and the Rams. A great rivalry game out west, and I think he must absolutely start Robert Woods against the division rival Seahawks, who we know have had some coverage issues this season, to put it lightly. He had 18 targets in 2 games against Seattle last year. The systems are the same. Seattle playing a ton of man coverage in the last 2 weeks, despite being one of the worst teams at it in the entire league per Next Gen Stats. It's all screaming, yes, it's Seattle, so start everybody you can, but I think it's screaming Robert Woods to me.
Even Josh Reynolds is a sleeper, but there's a player that I'm a little bit concerned about this week, and it's Tyler Lockett. He's had fewer than 9 fantasy points in 4 out of his last 5 games, fewer than 50 yards in those contests as well. The good news is the last time I besmirched him on the air, he had 50 points against the Cardinals. So if you're starting Tyler Lockett, congratulations. I reverse jinxed for you.
Personal vendettas run the entire NFL as long as it involves Adam Reich. Can the Rams keep pace with the chef of 2020, Russell Wilson? The first 3 weeks of the season, LA looked like the Super Bowl squad of a couple years ago. Since week 4, though, yikes. But hey, let's focus on the positive going into the weekend. It is a feel-good Friday with Maurice Jones-Drew. MJD, help everybody, especially folks here in Los Angeles, feel better about LA's offense.
Well, Patrick, I actually went to Michael F. Florio's rankings, and I saw kind of what he was doing there. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to cheat off him, and I'm going to make a video about it. Cue the music, and let's roll, because we are all visual learners. Let's roll this tape a little bit. Here we go. We have Darrell Henderson here, okay? And it is November, starting to get a little chilly. And anytime you get a running back and a linebacker, we freeze that guy, and we give enough space so Jared Goff can drop you a dime, right? It's Christmas is coming. Presents are going to be here. Let's go here. Cooper Kupp is at the top of the screen. He's going to come down. All these plays are showing man-to-man, which we know the Seattle Seahawks like to do. And this is what these guys can do. You have a great route runner. Cooper Kupp is going to run an angle route. Now watch this shimmy shake he gives him. Bang! Freeze the DB. Guess what comes after you freeze the DB? A dime, a money bag. Get your run after catch here. And last but not least, you talked about a must start being Robert Woods. I tell you what, I believe in that too. Because as your safety here, Landon Collins, who's out right now on IR, he's looking at the slot receiver. But guess what? He gets frozen because Robert Woods is screaming down the sideline, and Jared Goff is going to drop just a money bag in the bucket. You know, just right in the bucket, take off and get a touchdown. I expect the Rams to go out and have a great second half because, one, they're playing their divisional opponents, and these receivers like Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods have huge games against them. Not only that, they have to bounce back. They have a chance to take the lead in the NFC West. This is a great time to do it.
Yeah, against the team that's allowing 362 yards a game through the air, which is the most in the Super Bowl era. They've made a lot of people feel good this year. And this is a feel-good Friday. Thanks to MJD. When we come back, looking forward to Sunday. It's time for us to make a day of it today as we ask our panel to tell us how they would put together a daily fantasy lineup for Week 10. Marcus Grant, how would you make a day of it on Sunday?
We talked earlier in the show about that Packers-Jaguars game, and Patrick, you made the point that I think was astute, that we feel like a lot of points are going to come on that Packers side. So I went with a triple stack, the Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, Robert Tonyan triple stack there. But I want to point to Miles Sanders, who's coming back for the Eagles after missing some time with an injury. Before he got hurt, he was really a workhorse in that offense. I expect he's going to go back to that workhorse role, and he's facing a Giants defense that's given up the second most receptions and the most receiving yards to running backs. Sanders is a dual threat guy, so there's an opportunity for Philadelphia to get the ball in his hand multiple ways this week. The other one I went with, which was sort of more of a value pick, was Randall Cobb. And the Browns, their secondary has some holes in it, and they've really struggled against slot receivers. The Browns have given up the third most catches, second most yards, third most touchdowns to slot receivers. So while I still love Will Fuller, I think Brandon Cook can have a big day. I keep an eye out for Randall Cobb, especially if you're looking for sort of a value pick for your daily lineup.
No, I really like that pick, Marcus, but I'm going to show you a little bit of what I was thinking of this week. I agree with you. You should try to find a high-scoring game and try to focus in on that. And I think that the Packers game is going to be a little chalky. So I'm going with the Raiders stack right here. And one of the highlights is going to be Darren Waller because he is probably the best tight end that you can play this week, I should say. He's had at least a touchdown and 13 fantasy points in 4 of his 5 games this season. The Broncos are coming off a game where they just gave up 13 points to Hayden Hurst. And then I compare him with Derek Carr, who's a pretty inexpensive option this week. But the one piece of advice that I'm going to give all of you that you need to know for this coming weekend, if you're putting together a daily lineup, especially on DraftKings, you want to make sure that you have Mike Davis, because this is the best value on the entire board. This should be your first pick. Get him in there. His matchup's good enough. The volume is going to be there. The price is right. So make sure that Mike Davis is in your lineup and then build around from there.
All right, enough with ranks lineup. Let's get my team up there. I think Rams fans will recognize this wide receiver trio. I went with the Rams because Seattle allows the most fantasy points to quarterbacks and receivers. And then I got Cooks and Ingram in there because they've been seeing big volume. But I built around the running backs, especially James Robinson. He's been so good, getting 16 touches in every game, 25 or more touches in 2 straight games. He's finished as a top 10 running back in 5 of his last 7. And it's a great matchup as the Packers allow the second most fantasy points and the most touchdowns to running backs. And then I also got Leonard Fournette in there for a bit cheaper. I think Leonard Fournette is the RB1 in Tampa Bay right now. He's played 2/3 of the snaps since returning from injury. He's seeing over 6 targets per game right now. Ronald Jones is down at 3. And that's big because the Panthers allow the most receptions as well as the 5th most fantasy points to running backs this season.
Oh, man, we are excited to see those offenses on the field in the desert this weekend, the Bills and the Cardinals, as we get back to our Sunday showdowns here on Fantasy Live. Florio, you're going to tell us to start one of your beloved Buffalo Bills, right?
Nope. I'm saying you could start Christian Kirk against my beloved Buffalo Bills. Kirk has played great, as you see there, over 20 fantasy points in 3 straight. And what's more impressive than that is in that stretch, he has more yards, touchdowns, red zone targets, targets of 20-plus air yards, and most importantly, more fantasy points than DeAndre Hopkins. I'm not saying use him over D-Hop, but D-Hop could see a lot of Trey White, which would also open up more for Christian Kirk.
All right. Well, fine, then, Mr. Florio. If you're not going to start a bill, then I will. And what an opportunity to do so after John Brown's triumphant return to the 15-point-plus realm a week ago, just in time for some revenge against a Cardinals secondary that might see Patrick Peterson a lot on Stephon Diggs. Brown excels once Josh Allen leaves the pocket. I think this could be a nice revenge opportunity for Smokey coming up in the total access game of the week. Let's go over to the Texans and Browns. Ranky got a sleeper?
Yeah, I like Rashard Higgins, who's had at least 12 fantasy points in 2 out of his last 4 games. He's done a really nice job ever since OBJ went down. And he's got a great matchup against the Texans, who've allowed the 7th most fantasy points to wide receivers this season. The only piece of caution I will throw out there is that if the weather turns in Cleveland, and it certainly can, this could end up like a game a couple of weeks ago when the Raiders were there and it was really run heavy. So I'm trying not to say that this is a fair weather start, but I kind of am.
Must start Will Fuller. And I tell you what, it's one thing that happens is Deshaun Watson came out after the trade deadline and said, you know what? If they traded Will Fuller, all heck was going to break loose in Houston. And guess what? I believe him. Will Fuller has been balling as of late, and as Deshaun Watson goes, Will Fuller will go with him. And then the Cleveland Browns, they're allowing the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And to me, it just seems like a matchup made in heaven. And even if the weather turns bad, Deshaun Watson's still going to throw the ball.
All right, let's go over to the Broncos and the Raiders. Florio, what you got?
I'm saying beware of Josh Jacobs. He has not been playing too well as of late. As you see on the screen there, 80 rush yards, fewer than 80 rush yards in 5 of his last 6 games. You're expecting big rush yards out of him, right? So if he can't get that, you're like, all right, maybe he can make up for it in the passing game. 1 target in 2 straight games. So then you're hoping for a touchdown. Well, the Broncos have allowed just 3 rushing touchdowns to running backs this season. So I know you're sick of hearing it if you drafted Josh Jacobs, but I'm saying beware of him this week.
The Broncos have allowed 14 receptions in the last 2 games, so I'm hopeful that Josh Jacobs can get into the mix there. And if you're looking for a quarterback, Drew Lock is a pretty good option. He's had 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games. Obviously, he ran for 1 last week. 5 touchdown passes in those contests. The Raiders have allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks this season, as I alluded to when I was doing the make a day of it. I love this game to be very high scoring, so Drew Lock could be a very good streaming option for you.
Yeah, and we've been talking up the Broncos offense for the past couple of weeks. Drew Lock is not the only quarterback that Adam Rank likes as a streamer on Sunday. Here's a look at the next blockbuster from fantasy filmmaker Adam Rank, a summer action flick with tons of star power on Now Streaming.
In a world where speed is king, bitter rivals can become closer than family. Now, with the season on the line and Mahomes on a bye, a fellow racer has to spring into action.
I want to win football games.
But does this car have the horsepower to overtake the Broncos?
The fact that's a question is kind of offensive to me.
He's not fast, but he is furious. Car Trouble, now streaming.
Oh, Car Trouble, gotta love it. Oh, just one of the best filmmakers of the TV world in Adam Rank. It's time to check out some surprising sleepers presented by Geico. Each week, Michael F. Florio publishes his list of fantasy sleepers for the week ahead. Florio, who did we spotlight this week?
Yeah, I don't know how I'm supposed to follow now streaming, but I'm spotlighting Jalen Reagor from the Eagles right now. And right before the bye, he had 6 targets in his first game back, and 2 of those went for 20 or more air yards. They didn't connect on any, but I like his chances of connecting on a deep one this week, as the Giants have allowed the 7th most catches of 20-plus air yards this year. And I'm sorry, Giants fans, I know you have nightmares of Deshaun Jackson tearing you guys up for years. I think Jalen Reagor could be the second coming of that.
I really like that pick, and if he's not available, I would take a look at Jakeem Grant, who's going to step up with Preston Wilson placed on the IR. Now, he ran 17 routes versus Arizona in Week 9. That was the second most amongst Miami wide receivers, and the Chargers have allowed at least 2 touchdown receptions in 3 consecutive games. With the change at quarterback with Tua Tagovailoa, I love this pick.
Yeah, and if he's not there, I'm going to go with Josh Reynolds. And I'll tell you why. The Seattle Seahawks, we've already talked about how they give up a ton of pass yards to everyone. Josh Reynolds is a guy that the Rams love to target in the red zone because of his big body frame, but they also like him going down the field as we see here. And so I think when you get those shot opportunities, which the Rams are going to take a ton of, Josh Reynolds might be a guy. And then plus, if you want to know anything more, just listen to the broadcast because I'm on there.
All right, I got a sleeper. This one's easy for me because Nelson Aguilar is available in 80+% of leagues, and he's averaging 15 points per game in his last 4 starts if you take out that windy wind fest in Cleveland that Rank was talking about earlier. I think he's a big part of this offense that's gone under the Raider radar. It's hard to catch Nelson Aguilar as a sleeper this weekend. We're back here on NFL Fantasy Live. Pittsburgh home to the last remaining undefeated team in the NFL. Ben Roethlisberger expected to come off that COVID-19 list tomorrow, facing a 2-win Bengals team, but we're not picking a winner. This is fantasy football, so MJD, give us a sit in this game.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and sit Eric Ebron, and it's less about him more that Big Ben hasn't been there, and he has to get on the page with those wide receivers, and he's been touchdown dependent, as you can see at the bottom. He has less than 60 yards receiving in all the games he's played this season. And to me, it seems like Big Ben is going to try to get the ball to those receivers on the outside.
I'll give you a start in this game. I think you should be starting Tyler Boyd this week. He's been very safe. You see there's 16 fantasy points. He also has 6 or more targets in 7 straight games. But what I really like about Boyd and this matchup this week is the Steelers allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to slot receivers, including a league-high 6 touchdowns, and Tyler Boyd runs 77% of his routes from the slot.
Let's go over to Washington and Detroit. Marcus, what we got?
I would say just to beware of DeAndre Swift. Part of it is the matchup. This Washington defense has been fairly stingy when it comes to fantasy running backs, but part of it is just the situation. As much as we want DeAndre Swift to be the workhorse there, wishing doesn't make it so. He's still in a committee, which is frustrating because we see Adrian Peterson getting touches. Kerryon Johnson has gotten into the act the last week or two. So I think the combination of a bad matchup and a limited number of opportunities makes me sort of wary of Swift this week.
Yeah, and I'm going to say sleeper Danny Amendola, and I'm going to take this from Adam Rank. We talked about this on Wednesday. With Galladay being out, Amendola had 10 targets last week against Minnesota. Expect that to go on. They're going to try to throw the ball a little bit against the Washington football team. That's where their weakness is. Amendola is going to be a great play for you if you can get him in your flex.
All right, finally, we will go to the Eagles and the Giants, and I've got a bit of a beware because it's time for me to say goodbye to a move that I felt good about a few times this season. Just Darius Slayton, who hasn't been able to succeed through almost little fault of his own. Daniel Jones has just not been able to make it happen with him, and you've got to punt eventually. He hasn't had a touchdown since week 6. He had 1 target against the football team, and now he's up against a team that he got a whopping 5 points against just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, and Patrick, I'm saying you could start the Giants' one reliable pass catcher, Evan Ingram. His fantasy points have increased in 4 straight games. He has topped double-digit fantasy points in his last 3 and has had 9 or more targets in each of those games, a streak that started against this Eagles team, who is allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to tight ends. Opportunity plus a good matchup, I think it equals a good fantasy day for Evan Ingram.
Network coming up right after us. It's time for some fantasy feedback. We're going to appropriate some Twitter culture here that you've probably seen some form of going around these past couple of days. What's something that seemed like a good idea in fantasy football, but is it? And we asked you on Twitter, and we got some interesting responses, like this one from Cody. Starting Tyler Lockett every week, hoping for any sort of consistency. Marcus, has DK Metcalf sunk his teammates' value that much?
A little bit. I think more of it, though, is just sort of how he's being used in the offense. Nearly 2/3 of his catches are on short throws, basically within 10 air yards of the line of scrimmage, which means you need a lot of them or a touchdown for him to have a pretty good day. His biggest games have come when he's caught some deep throws. He only has 3 catches on throws of 20 yards deep down the field. 1 in week 3 when he had 37 points, 2 in week 7 when he had 53 points. So the question is, can he and Russell Wilson connect on these deep throws? Then, when that happens, you're more likely to get a big day out of Tyler Lockett.
All right, Duncan says taking quarterbacks early in the draft rank. There's a reason we tell people not to do this.
Yeah, why don't we take a look at the quarterbacks who are drafted early here. With Patrick Mahomes, obviously that one worked out. Lamar Jackson, people are upset. But Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson, pretty good. And, of course, unfortunately, Dak was going to be on pace to be with guys like Mahomes and Russell Wilson. But, unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. And I think, though, it'll still be a thing because of Justin Herbert this season. In this game right there, where Patrick Mahomes did that, Justin Herbert emerged like a beacon when you're driving down the highway and there are no lights around. It's like when you're coming over into Prim, Nevada, and you see the lights just shining. You're like, what is that? Oh, it's Justin Herbert, who's been fantastic. I mean, he's averaged close to 25 fantasy points per game. He's the QB4. And this was a guy who got his first start 6 minutes before the game actually started. They're like, oh, yeah, you've got to start the game right now. There's been a mishap. And all of a sudden now, this guy is the best, one of the best quarterbacks in fantasy football.
Well, we got to get him off the side of the road on that dark, lonely highway. All right, MJD, Tyson sent us this. Playing players on Thursday Night Football just so the games were exciting. MJD, we saw Jonathan Taylor and Ryan Tannehill struggle last night.
Yeah, I mean, hey, maybe those guys, to be honest with you, I enjoyed Thursday Night Football. I actually balled on Thursday night. It was like date night for me, for whoever I was playing against. This is so happened to be the Indianapolis Colts. They got to work this week, week 15, 2009. And, you know, I enjoyed it. I think on a short week, it's hard for a defense to game plan and scheme against you, and you can take advantage of it. We did that day. I don't know if we won that game or not, but I know I won my fantasy week because I balled out.
MJD averaging over 5 yards a carry in his career on Thursday. And how about this? The GOAT PG-13 didn't work out for his squad. Didn't work out for his fantasy team either. It says he took Kenyon Drake over Devontae Adams. Sometimes the hype and the trends get to us. We make some mistakes. Rest in peace if you took him over Devontae Adams, but a lot of people took Kenyon Drake high this year. That's all our time this week. Monday, we're going to be back with a complete fantasy preview of the Vikings and Bears on Monday Night Football. Fantasy Live, back with you Monday at 6 Eastern. TA's coming up. Watch them, and then enjoy your weekend. Thanks for watching, everybody.